So the sports outlet Essentially Sports put an article out saying that the likely headliner for UFC Saudi Arabia, which is taking place in March, is Sharaputdin Magomedov. And I find this interesting for a lot of reasons. The main reason being that he's only had one fight in the UFC. So to headline a card in your second ever fight in the organization is kind of unprecedented. And then also the opponent that they're talking about. They mentioned Marvin Vettori in the article, and we know those two have been jawing back and forth on social media, but Marvin Vettori is number 5 in the rankings. So if they're going to put the Shara Bullet against the number 5 fighter in the division in his second fight, that shows you what they think of him and his potential.
Yeah, I agree. And I think he looked really good in his debut against Bruno Silva, but jumping up to the number 5 spot and jumping up to Marvin Vettori is a serious jump. And the UFC has shown us recently that they're not afraid to fast track somebody. And I think they're onto something with him. His striking looked real good against Bruno Silva, and Marvin Vettori is great everywhere. But if there's one place that he lacks, and that's kind of the one reason that he hasn't become a UFC champion yet, it's because his striking's not quite at the pinnacle of 185 like we've seen with a Robert Whittaker, like we've seen with Israel Adesanya, and seems to be Sharaputdin's going to be just as promising of a striker. And even though he's really good everywhere, Marvin Vettori's good everywhere, and you can't really get into the UFC unless you are a star in all aspects of fighting, Sharaputdin's going to come in with some very electric striking, and if Marvin Vettori's not careful, he could wind up losing his number 5 spot to an unranked guy.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting, and you talk about other athletes that are fast-tracked, Bo Nickel, Khamzat Chimaev, but they're talking about Bo Nickel now being the first of the early prelims on UFC 300.
Wow.
Now, any slot on UFC 300 is meaningful, so that's a special night, and it's going to be a very electric card.
For sure.
But the first early prelim for a UFC pay-per-view event compared to the headliner for the inaugural Saudi Arabia event, certainly the headliner carries more weight, and Bo Nickel is somebody the UFC holds in very high regard. So if you see that Sharaputdin is getting even better slots than Bo Nickel, that shows you what their thoughts are about where he might go. And Marvin Vettori is good everywhere. We'll assume that Marvin's going to be the opponent. Right. Could be Jared Cannonier, but if you're going to put, for your first ever event in Saudi Arabia, a guy like Sharaputdin on the top of the bill, you would think that they're going to put an athlete who's recognized worldwide and high up in the rankings to be his dance partner. You know, the Bruno Silva fight was fun, but you wouldn't headline an event for the first time ever in a new location with Sharaputdin and Bruno Silva. Sharaputdin's the guy you're trying to build, and you're going to put in there with him somebody who already has an established name. So that's why I'm just going to operate under the assumption that it's probably going to be Marvin Vettori. And those guys are the two that have kind of gone back and forth on social media and whatnot. So Marvin Vettori is good everywhere. He's got very powerful striking. He's extremely strong. He's good on the ground. As you said, he's not a super dynamic striker. It's very meat and potatoes. It's ones and twos, but he does have a lot of power. And I think where Sharaputdin would have an advantage is the fact that he's a little bit more dynamic. You know, we saw him off of his back standing up from the ground throw that whipping kick to the face, and he's doing a lot of spinning maneuvers, back fists, things like that, flying knees. He's an extraordinarily dynamic striker, and if you put him in there against Vettori, he's going to have the test of fighting a guy who's a veteran of the sport, who has defeated former world champions, been in there with almost every champion in the division over the last couple of years, and has the experience to win a 5-round fight on any given night. So I love the fight, and I think it's a very tough night out for both gentlemen.
Yeah, I'm all for them fast-tracking these fighters, and I think Shara Bullet is deserving. He's got a lot of potential, and he's got a lot of star power. I mean, he's an undeniable character. And it doesn't seem to me like the days of old where you had to fight 20, 30 times before you could get your title shot just exist anymore. Everybody's just fighting differently now. They're making their way into the UFC in different unconventional ways, and I'm all for it. I know if you go into the comment section of some of these posts, you'll see people just really angry and up in arms about somebody getting a main event slot or a title fight after just a couple of fights. But that's how the game is played, and somebody like Shara Bullet shouldn't be blamed for taking the opportunity that the UFC is trying to give him. And when you look at the top 10, you're absolutely right. Marvin Vettori's name really does stick out because while there's a ton of killers at the top of 185, Marvin Vettori's the one that's known worldwide, and he doesn't have a dance partner right now. And him and Sharaputdin kind of went back and forth at each other for a few weeks on the internet, and they were kind of poking at each other saying, hey, let's get this thing signed. And then they kind of stopped talking about each other. And the golden rule is if you guys go instigate a fight fight and you start to get the UFC behind it and they get excited about it, then they go radio silent so the UFC can get the contracts out to them, get the paperwork out, and nobody accidentally spills the beans and breaks a rumor where the UFC's trying to do it. So I have a feeling it's going to be Marvin Vettori, and I think that was the right move for the UFC to do. Obviously, you got Jared Cannonier. You've got guys like Jack Hermanson. You've got Roman Galizze and Brendan Allen. All these tough fights, but none of those names sit as well with Sharaputdin as a headline for Saudi Arabia like Marvin Vettori's.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think it's going to be a fun fight. And like you said, that golden rule that if two guys are jawing at each other and then all of a sudden it goes radio silent, that's usually because there's some news that we don't know about yet.
There's your sign.
Yep.